Picture this. It's 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in downtown Los Angeles. The gleaming towers of Century City pierce the darkness like scattered diamonds against the black sky. Inside the 42nd floor of the prestigious Meridian Business Center, the last traces of another corporate day are being swept away by invisible hands. But what happened in elevator number 3 that night would shake the very foundations of one of America's most powerful companies. Because sometimes the person you dismiss as just the help turns out to be the one person who can destroy everything you've built with a single sentence. But what happened in elevator number 3 that night would shake the very foundations of one of America's most powerful companies. Because sometimes the person you dismiss as just the help turns out to be the one person who can destroy everything you've built with a single sentence. Her name was Grace Washington, and she was about to teach billionaire Marcus Kingsley a lesson that would cost him millions, his reputation, and ultimately his entire empire. But before we get to that devastating moment, you need to understand who Grace really was. Because the truth about her past would make Marcus's humiliation even more spectacular. Grace moved through the empty offices like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by plush carpeting that cost more per square foot than most people made in a week. She'd been cleaning these offices for 3 years now, arriving after the executives went home to their mansions in Beverly Hills, working through the night while the city slept below. To the corporate world, she was invisible. Just another middle-aged black woman in a cleaning uniform, someone who emptied trash cans and wiped down conference tables where million-dollar deals were made. They saw the name tag that read Gracie Maintenance Staff and assumed they knew her whole story. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Grace Washington held 2 master's degrees, one in international business from UCLA and another in Latin American studies from USC. She spoke 5 languages fluently: English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian. She had once worked as a translator for the United Nations, spent 2 years in Madrid as a cultural attaché, and had been featured on the cover of International Business Weekly as one of the rising stars under 40 in global commerce. That was before the scandal that wasn't her fault destroyed her career. Before the whispered accusations and the closed doors. Before she found herself starting over at 53. Taking any job that would pay the bills, while she fought to clear her name from a corruption case she had nothing to do with. The setup had been perfect. Someone in the UN's financial department had been embezzling development funds meant for water purification projects in Guatemala. When the theft was discovered, they needed a scapegoat. Grace's high profile and recent promotion made her the perfect target. Forged documents, manipulated bank records, and leaked photos taken out of context painted her as a corrupt official living beyond her means. The charges were eventually dropped when the real thief was caught, but by then Grace's reputation was destroyed. Her husband left her. Her savings were gone to legal fees. Her mother had to go back to cleaning houses, and Grace found herself doing the same work her mother had done decades earlier, invisible to the very people who had once sought her expertise. But Marcus Kingsley didn't know any of that. All he saw was what he wanted to see: someone beneath him. Marcus Kingsley was exactly the kind of man who measured his worth by looking down at others. At 45, he ran Kingsley Global Ventures, a tech conglomerate worth $8.2 billion. His company owned everything from social media platforms to satellite technology, and Marcus never let anyone forget it. He was tall, silver-haired, and wore suits that cost more than most people's annual salaries. His watch was a limited edition Patek Philippe worth $300,000. His shoes were handmade in Italy by craftsmen who had waiting lists longer than most people's mortgages. Even his cologne was custom blended by a perfumer in Paris who worked exclusively for billionaires. Marcus lived in a 15,000-square-foot mansion in Bel Air, complete with a wine cellar that held bottles worth more than luxury cars. He drove a different supercar each day of the week. Monday was the Bugatti, Tuesday the McLaren, Wednesday the Lamborghini. He owned vacation homes in Aspen, the Hamptons, and Monaco, each staffed with people he never bothered to learn the names of. But what Marcus treasured most was his sense of superiority. He thrived on making others feel small, on reminding them of their place in his world. He spoke 3 languages himself: English, Spanish, and German, and he loved using that knowledge to exclude, to mock, to humiliate people he thought couldn't understand him. That night, he was leaving the office later than usual. A crucial merger with a European tech firm was falling apart. His stock price had dropped 8% in the past week, and his board of directors was asking uncomfortable questions about his leadership style. Several key employees had quit recently, citing toxic work environment in their exit interviews. Marcus was frustrated, angry, and looking for someone to take it out on. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, and there stood Grace, her cleaning cart beside her, waiting patiently. She had learned over the years to step aside when executives approached, to make herself even smaller and more invisible. Her eyes were respectful but distant, the look of someone who had learned not to expect acknowledgement from people like him. Marcus stepped into the elevator, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. He glanced at Grace dismissively, then pulled out his phone and began typing furiously. The merger documents, the legal complications, the pressure from his investors, it was all building up inside him like steam in a kettle ready to explode. As the elevator began its descent from the 42nd floor, Marcus noticed Grace quietly reorganizing supplies on her cart. Something about her calm efficiency irritated him. Maybe it was the stress of the failing merger. Maybe it was the way his board had questioned his judgment earlier that day. Maybe it was the fact that his ex-wife's lawyer had called demanding higher alimony payments. Or maybe it was just who Marcus Kingsley really was underneath all that expensive clothing, a small, cruel man who needed to hurt others to feel powerful. The elevator stopped at the 38th floor and his assistant James stepped in. James was 26, fresh out of business school and desperate to impress his billionaire boss. He hung on Marcus's every word, laughed at his jokes whether they were funny or not, and never questioned his judgment even when it was clearly wrong. "You know what I love about working late?" Marcus said in English, his voice carrying that particular tone wealthy men use when they think they're being clever. He gestured vaguely toward Grace as if she were part of the office furniture. Then he switched to Spanish, his words sharp and mocking. "Esque puedes ver quien realmente trabaja duro y quien simplemente está aquí para limpiar la mujer de gente más exitosa." The translation was devastating. It's that you can see who really works hard and who's just here to clean up the dirt of more successful people. James chuckled nervously, glancing at Grace to make sure she hadn't understood. Marcus continued, emboldened by what he thought was his linguistic superiority. "Mira esta mujer. Probablemente en sequira termino la secundaria, pero aquí está limpiando después de personas que realmente importan. Es casi poético, no crees? Look at this woman. She probably didn't even finish high school, but here she is cleaning up after people who actually matter. It's almost poetic, don't you think?" The cruelty in his words was breathtaking. The casual dismissal of someone's entire existence, the assumptions based on nothing but prejudice, the arrogance of speaking about someone in a language he assumed she couldn't understand. But what happened next would be even more devastating for him. Grace didn't look up from her cart immediately. She continued organizing her supplies with the same careful precision she'd shown for the past 3 years. Her hands were steady, her breathing even. But inside, something was shifting, something that had been dormant for years was awakening. She had heard every word, every syllable of Marcus's cruel assessment had landed exactly where he intended it to, except he had no idea who he was really talking about. Grace had been hearing comments like this for 3 years, had developed thick skin and learned to let them roll off her. But something about tonight was different. Maybe it was the particular cruelty of his tone. Maybe it was the way he laughed as he said it. Or maybe it was simply that Grace Washington was tired of being invisible. The elevator continued its descent. 35th floor, 32nd floor. 29th floor, 28th floor. Marcus was still smirking, still enjoying his moment of perceived superiority. James was still chuckling awkwardly, still playing the role of the sycophantic assistant. Neither of them noticed the subtle change in Grace's posture, the way her shoulders had straightened just a fraction, the way her jaw had set with quiet determination. 27th floor, 26th floor, 25th floor. Grace finished organizing her supplies and turned around slowly. Her eyes, which Marcus had dismissed as unremarkable, now held something that made him pause mid-smirk. There was intelligence there. Authority, command, and something else that made his stomach flutter with the first hint of unease, disappointment. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and in perfect, accentless Spanish that carried the authority of someone who had addressed world leaders. Señor Kingsley. Es fascinante como un hombre que construyó su imperio en tecnología global puede ser tan increíblemente pequeño en su visión del mundo. Mr. Kingsley, it's fascinating how a man who built his empire on global technology can be so incredibly small in his worldview. The elevator suddenly felt like it had stopped moving, even though the floor numbers kept changing. Marcus's phone slipped slightly in his suddenly sweaty palm. James's nervous chuckle died in his throat like a strangled animal. The air in the small space became thick people with tension. But Grace wasn't finished. She had spent 3 years in silence, 3 years being dismissed and overlooked. 3 years watching people like Marcus assume they knew her story, her worth, her capabilities. Tonight, that silence was ending. También es interesante, she continued, her Spanish flawless and devastating, como alguien puede asumir tanto sobre una persona sin saber absolutamente nada sobre ella. Por ejemplo, usted asume que no termina la secundaria. En realidad tengo dos maestrías, una de UCLA y otra de USC. Hablo 5 idiomas con fluidez y trabajé para las Naciones Unidas durante 8 años antes de venir aquí. It's also interesting how someone can assume so much about a person without knowing absolutely anything about them. For example, you assume I didn't finish high school. Actually, I have 2 master's degrees, one from UCLA and another from USC. I speak 5 languages fluently and worked for the United Nations for 8 years before coming here. The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the elevator's mechanical hum, the faint whistle of air conditioning, even the sound of Marcus's expensive watch ticking. Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. James looked like he wanted to disappear into the elevator walls. Grace tilted her head slightly, her expression still calm but now carrying the weight of absolute authority. Y por último, Señor Kingsley, debería saber que su pronunciación del español es bastante mediocre para alguien que lo usa para insultar a otros. Tal vez debería tomar algunas lecciones antes de intentar humillar a alguien más. And finally, Mr. Kingsley, you should know that your Spanish pronunciation is quite mediocre for someone who uses it to insult others. Perhaps you should take some lessons before attempting to humiliate someone else. The elevator reached the ground floor with a soft ding that seemed to echo like thunder in the silence. The doors opened, revealing the marble lobby of the Meridian building, empty except for a lone security guard reading a newspaper at his desk. Grace stepped out first, pulling her cart behind her with the same quiet dignity she had carried into the elevator. She moved with purpose now, her spine straight, her head high. For the first time in 3 years, she looked like the international executive she had once been. She paused just outside the elevator doors and turned back to face Marcus, who was still frozen in shock, his mouth slightly open, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume on a man pretending to be important. In English now, her voice gentle but carrying unmistakable steel. Have a good evening, Mr. Kingsley. I hope tomorrow brings you more wisdom than tonight has shown. And then she walked away, her footsteps echoing across the marble floor, leaving Marcus and James standing in that elevator like 2 statues, staring after her in complete and utter silence. But that 30-second elevator encounter was just the beginning. Because Marcus Kingsley had no idea that Grace Washington wasn't just a former UN executive with hurt feelings. She was a woman with connections, credibility, and a story that was about to explode across the internet like wildfire. What happened next would turn that brief elevator ride into a global phenomenon that would destroy Marcus's reputation, cost him his company, and serve as a warning to every powerful person who thinks they can dismiss others without consequences. The next morning, Grace woke up in her small apartment in Boyle Heights to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop since 6 a.m., and she couldn't understand why. She made coffee, sat down at her small kitchen table, and started going through the messages. The first was from her brother Carlos. Grace, check Twitter, now. The second was from her former colleague at the UN. Saw the video. I'm so proud of you. The world needed to see this video. What video? Grace opened Twitter with trembling fingers and saw her name trending. Not just trending, it was the #1 topic in the United States and #3 globally. The hashtag elevator justice had been shared over 200,000 times in the past 6 hours. The video was everywhere. Someone had somehow obtained the elevator's security footage and audio, edited it into a tight 2-minute clip, and released it to the world. Grace watched herself on her phone screen, standing calmly in that elevator, listening to Marcus's cruel Spanish mockery, then delivering her devastating reply with perfect composure and dignity. But this wasn't just the raw security footage. Someone with serious video editing skills had added professional subtitles in both English and Spanish, highlighted the crucial moments, and included context about both Grace's and Marcus's backgrounds that made the contrast even more stark. The video opened with text that made Grace gasp. Marcus Kingsley, net worth $8.2 billion, CEO of Kingsley Global Ventures, owns 3 mansions, 7 luxury cars. Then, Grace Washington, former UN executive, speaks 5 languages, holds 2 master's degrees, works night shift as housekeeper after false corruption charges destroyed her career. The editing was masterful, making Marcus look even worse than he had in person. Every smirk, every cruel chuckle, every dismissive gesture was highlighted and slowed down. Grace's calm, dignified response was shown with subtitles that made her eloquence and composure even more striking. The video ended with text that brought tears to Grace's eyes. Grace Washington was falsely accused of embezzlement in 2019. All charges were dropped when the real thief was caught. She has been working as a housekeeper for 3 years while fighting to rebuild her reputation. Marcus Kingsley makes $47 million per year and just lost $400 million in stock value since this video went viral. Her phone rang. It was Maria Santos, the woman who owned the cleaning company Grace worked for and who happened to be one of the most powerful Latina business women in California, worth an estimated $400 million. Maria said, her voice filled with pride and excitement. I hope you're ready for the ride of your life. Grace was still staring at her phone in shock, watching the view count climb past 500,000. Maria, how did this get out? The elevator footage, my background information. Who could have accessed all of this? Maria chuckled, a sound that carried decades of business savvy. Let's just say that when you've been in business as long as I have, you learn that information is the most powerful currency of all. And sometimes people with access to that information get very upset when they see injustice. Did you? I made some phone calls, but Grace, this story is spreading because people are hungry for it. They're tired of watching powerful men humiliate working people. They're tired of assumptions and prejudice dressed up as jokes. Your story is giving them hope that sometimes, just sometimes, the arrogant get exactly what they deserve. As if to prove Maria's point, Grace's phone buzzed with a call from a 212 area code, New York. Ms. Washington, this is Rebecca Martinez from Good Morning America. We'd love to have you on the show tomorrow to tell your story. We can fly you to New York tonight, put you up in a nice hotel, and I promise you'll be treated with the respect you deserve. Before Grace could respond, another call came in. Then another, CNN, The Today Show, 60 Minutes. The Ellen DeGeneres Show, Univision, Telemundo. The View, Stephen Colbert's People, Trevor Noah's team. Everyone wanted to interview the woman who had calmly destroyed a billionaire's arrogance with nothing but the truth and perfect Spanish. Meanwhile, across town in his Bel Air mansion, Marcus Kingsley was discovering that his 30-second moment of cruelty was going to cost him everything he had spent his life building. His phone had been ringing non-stop since 5 a.m., his publicist was in full damage control mode. His lawyers were drafting statements, his board of directors had called an emergency meeting for noon, but the damage was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. His stock price had dropped 18% before markets even opened. Major clients were calling to terminate their contracts. His biggest investor, a German tech firm, had released a statement saying they were reassessing their relationship with Kingsley Global Ventures in light of recent events that do not align with our values. The video had done more than expose his arrogance, it had revealed his character to the world, and in an age where reputation could be destroyed in minutes and shared with millions, Marcus was learning that some mistakes can't be fixed with money or lawyers. By the end of the week, Marcus Kingsley would be forced to resign from his own company. His net worth would drop by over $1 billion. His wife would file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and public humiliation. His children would change their last names to avoid association with him. Grace Washington, meanwhile, would be offered positions at 3 major multinational corporations, a book deal worth 7 figures, and speaking fees that exceeded her annual salary as a housekeeper for a single appearance. The elevator encounter had lasted 30 seconds. But the lesson would last forever. Never underestimate the person in front of you. You don't know their story. You don't know their strength. You don't know their connections, and sometimes the people you dismiss the fastest are the ones who will leave you speechless and unemployed. So let this story serve as a reminder to all of us: respect costs you nothing, but as Marcus Kingsley learned in the most painful way possible, disrespect can cost you everything.